Good evening, my dear friends, and all who have gathered here seeking that quiet revelation of the Spirit. In the manner Joel S. Goldsmith so often began, softly, reverently, inviting you not merely to listen, but to enter a sacred atmosphere. I want to welcome you into a moment of stillness, a pause in the noise, a meeting place where the infinite can be felt, even before it is understood. Today, we turn to a message that is not mine, but one that echoes from the heart of Joel S. Goldsmith himself, a message offered not as a warning of fear, but as a call to awaken before the world distracts you into forgetting who you truly are. The topic before us is, before it's too late, why you need to understand Joel Goldsmith's final warning. And so I invite you, gently, sincerely, to listen not with your ears alone, but with that inner place Joel called the temple not made with hands, for what we are about to explore may shift the very direction of your spiritual journey. Because the real question is this: what was Goldsmith trying to tell us, quietly, persistently, before he left this world? And more importantly, why is the meaning of that message more urgent now than ever before? Before we go deeper, take a moment, like this video, comment a symbolic number that resonates with your spirit today, and subscribe, because what comes next may be the key you've unknowingly searched for all along, and you won't want to miss where this journey leads. And so we begin with the first truth Goldsmith pressed upon all sincere seekers. The illusion of external power must be recognized before true awakening begins. Because as Joel reminded us again and again, the greatest barrier to spiritual freedom is not the world, not circumstances, not other people, but our belief that anything outside of us can govern, limit, bless, or endanger our lives. This belief is the ancient hypnotism of humanity, the universal mistake that keeps the soul wandering in fear and uncertainty. Goldsmith would say, quietly but firmly, that we suffer not because of what happens in the world, but because we have accepted the world as the source of our good and the cause of our harm. We bow to conditions, we react to appearances, we chase after security in things that are themselves insecure. And in doing so, we forget the one truth that dissolves the entire dream of struggle, that a spirit alone is power. Don't trust at everything else, no matter how solid, loud, or threatening it appears, has no authority of its own. He would often point out that humanity has placed its trust in money, governments, medicine, relationships, opportunities, luck, and outer achievements, each one treated as if it holds the keys to life. Yet every outward dependency eventually reveals its instability. People change, markets collapse, bodies weaken, plans crumble, fortunes vanish, and when they do, the individual who has relied on these external structures feels shaken, because the foundation itself was not spiritual, but material. Goldsmith's teaching was not a criticism of the world, but a revelation that the world is effect, never cause. That conditions are shadows, not sources. That the moment we assign power to anything outside the infinite invisible, we enter the realm of fear, because we now feel we must defend, protect, and preserve something that was never real power to begin with. He used the phrase mental malpractice to describe this tendency, not as a judgment of others, but as a description of the mind's capacity to hypnotize itself. When we think a circumstance can control our destiny, we have already given it our spiritual authority. When we think a person has the power to bless us or harm us, we have already stepped out of the kingdom of spirit and into the shadows of the senses. And yet, at the moment we see that no condition has independent life or law of its own, a profound shift takes place within us. Fear loosens its grip. Anxiety begins to fade. We stop fighting appearances and begin recognizing them for what they are: temporary forms passing across the screen of consciousness, without substance, without permanence, and without actual power. Goldsmith called this recognition the first step into true freedom, not because it solves every problem instantly, but because it removes the only thing that ever empowered the problem, our belief in it. When the illusion of external power dissolves, We no longer chase after the world for security. We no longer tremble before circumstances. We begin, gently and naturally, to look inward, to that quiet center from which all real authority flows. And it is from this shift, this turning away from shadows toward source, that the deeper message of his final warning begins to unfold. From that recognition, we move into the second truth Goldsmith emphasized with unwavering clarities. This conscious union with the invisible presence is the only real security. For once you see that no external thing has power over your life, the question naturally arises, then where does true power come from? Goldsmith's answer was always the same, spoken without drama, without strain, simply, plainly. As one who had lived it, it comes from the invisible presence, dwelling at the center of your own being. He often said that this presence is not a theory, not a belief, not a comforting idea whispered to ease the mind. It is a living reality that reveals itself only when the seeker becomes still enough to feel it, humble enough to trust it, and patient enough to wait for its movement within. And this is why he used the term conscious union. For the presence is always with us, but most are never consciously aware of it. We rush, we worry, we plan, we fear, we cling to outer supports, all the while ignoring the gentle, steady current of spirit silently sustaining us from within. To Goldsmith, security was not something achieved but something realized. It was not built, it was acknowledged. He taught that the presence is not somewhere far away waiting for your perfection. It is here now, closer than thought, nearer than breath. But unless we become consciously aware of it, we remain like a person standing in sunlight with closed eyes, surrounded by light, yet living as though in darkness. This is why so many people feel unsafe even when they have money, relationships, resources, and physical comfort. They are protected outwardly but insecure inwardly. Their safety depends on conditions remaining favorable, and conditions are never permanent. True security, Goldsmith would say, begins only when you anchor your life in that which never changes, the invisible presence that does not rise or fall with the tides of the world. He pointed out that every spiritual master across the ages discovered the same truth, that the presence becomes real not through belief, but through direct experience. And that experience arises when the individual becomes quiet enough to listen. Not listening for words, but listening inwardly, a deep receptivity, an inner resting, a willingness to allow something greater than the personal mind to take the lead. It is in this stillness that the first subtle movement is felt. Sometimes it comes as peace, sometimes as a warmth, sometimes as a sense of being held, and sometimes as nothing at all except a quiet knowing that you are no longer alone within yourself. Goldsmith would say that once you taste this inner assurance, even for a moment, you begin to live differently. You realize you don't walk into situations by yourself, you are accompanied. You don't make decisions alone. There is a wisdom present that guides without commanding, leads without forcing, and protects without needing to defend. This is the meaning of security, not the safety of the world, but the safety of consciousness illumined by spirit. And gradually, as this union deepens, fear begins to lose its authority, not because the world becomes easier, but because you no longer look to the world as your source of strength. What once shook you now passes like a shadow. What once threatened you now reveals its lack of substance. And what once seemed necessary for your survival now fades into its proper place as a temporary form, not a foundation. In this way, conscious union with the invisible presence becomes not just a spiritual idea, but the living core of your daily existence. The quiet assurance beneath your thoughts, the calm beneath your circumstances, and the true security the world has never been able to provide. From this deepening awareness arises the third truth Goldsmith stressed with almost parental tenderness. Human solutions fail because they arise from the very sense of separation they try to fix. Once you begin to lean upon the invisible presence, even slightly, You start to see how often the human mind rushes in with its own plans, strategies, fears, and remedies, believing it must repair, manage, control, or manipulate the outer world in order to find peace. But Goldsmith pointed out that the human mind is the creator of the very problems it tries to solve. It is like a shadow trying to rearrange itself in the hope of finding light. The more it struggles, the tighter the knot becomes. He would say that nearly all human problems, whether of health, finance, relationships, or purpose, stem from the belief that we live apart from the source of our being. And once that belief is accepted, the mind begins a frantic search for solutions, seeking safety in plans, healing in formulas, success in effort, and peace in outer circumstances. But because these efforts arise from the feeling of separation, they can never create unity or harmony. They merely rearrange the dream. Goldsmith often reminded seekers that the human mind, no matter how intelligent or educated, operates within limitation. It sees only fragments, never the whole. It reacts to appearances instead of perceiving reality. When a challenge arises, the mind rushes to fix the appearance, never realizing that appearances have no life of their own. They are projections, not powers. This is why human solutions tend to fluctuate. A problem may seem solved for a moment, only to reappear in a new form, under a new name, wearing a different mask. You fix one financial issue, and another takes its place. You resolve one relationship conflict, and a new tension arises somewhere else. You stabilize your health, and soon another concern emerges. It becomes a cycle, unceasing, exhausting, because the root cause has never been addressed, the belief in a self apart from God. Goldsmith called this belief the great misunderstanding, for the human mind thinks it can secure life by manipulating effects, when in truth, effects have no power, no self-existence, no authority to bless or harm. Trying to straighten out appearances is like trying to calm waves without touching the sea beneath them. Until the underlying consciousness shifts, the surface will continue to move. And yet, he did not criticize the human attempt, he understood it. He knew that people try to solve their problems in the only way they've been taught, through effort, logic, control, and resistance. But he invited them to see that these attempts keep the problem alive because they affirm the very separation that created it. When an individual begins to realize that the solution does not lie in rearranging the outer world, but in awakening to the presence within, a profound transformation begins. The mind quiets not in defeat, but in recognition that it cannot do what spirit alone can accomplish. The person stops striving to force outcomes and begins to listen for inner guidance, for that subtle movement of wisdom that never arises from fear. Decisions become clearer, not because the mind is sharper, but because it is no longer the one leading. And as this inner shift takes root, struggles begin to ease, often gently, sometimes surprisingly, not because external life has been manipulated into submission, but because the consciousness that once generated conflict is no longer the one governing your experience. From this recognition that human effort cannot resolve what was created by the sense of separation, we enter the fourth truth Goldsmith taught with unwavering consistency. Spiritual unfoldment requires silence, receptivity, and surrender, not effort. Once the mind realizes its limitations, the temptation is often to try harder, think deeper, pray louder, or accumulate more spiritual knowledge. But Goldsmith gently redirected seekers away from striving, reminding them that spirit does not respond to force, intensity, or mental exertion. Spirit reveals itself only when the ego steps aside, when the human mind, so accustomed to pushing, evaluating, and controlling, finally settles into quiet receptivity. He would say that spiritual growth is not achieved through effort, because effort belongs to the personal self, and the personal self cannot lift itself into a higher dimension of consciousness. What we call awakening is not earned, it is allowed. It comes as a grace, an inner movement, a dawning realization that arrives in its own time, like the rising of the sun. And just as no amount of human willpower can force the sunrise, No amount of personal striving can produce spiritual illumination. Goldsmith understood that silence is not the absence of sound, but the absence of mental struggle. It is a resting of the inner being, a letting go of the compulsion to direct the path. In this silence, the mind becomes like a still surface of water, clear enough that the reflection of the infinite can be seen. No longer agitated, no longer chasing answers, it becomes receptive to the gentle inflow of spiritual insight. Receptivity, he taught, is the true state of prayer. Not pleading, not asking, not affirming, not demanding, but listening. Listening with the whole being, as though expecting a whisper that can only be heard when every inner door stands open. This receptive state makes room for the presence that has always been there, but could not be felt through the noise of personal striving. And then there is surrender, not a passive resignation, not giving up in despair, but yielding the personal sense of self to the deeper reality at the core of one's being. Surrender is the recognition that the human self is not the guide, not the protector, not the source. It is the moment the individual stops trying to manage life and begins allowing the intelligence that formed the universe to assume its rightful role. Goldsmith described this surrender as the turning point, the place where spiritual life truly begins. He would often say that the reason so many seekers feel stuck is not because the path is difficult, but because they are trying to walk it with their own strength. They want illumination without relinquishing control, peace without releasing fear, guidance without quieting the mind. But spiritual unfoldment is not a journey of addition. It is a journey of subtraction. We do not become spiritual by accumulating practices or philosophies. We become spiritual as the layers of fear, effort, and ego gradually fall away. In this spaciousness, created by silence, deepened by receptivity, completed by surrender, something extraordinary begins to happen. There arises a calm that does not depend on circumstances, a clarity that does not come from thought, and an inner assurance that cannot be traced to any external cause. This is the beginning of true unfoldment, the natural flowering of consciousness when it is no longer obstructed by the noise and tension of the personal mind. And as this unfolding presence deepens, it gently reorganizes the inner life, not through force, but through grace, an invisible movement that prepares the seeker for the next revelation on the path. From this gentle unfolding, born of silence and surrender, we arrive at the fifth truth Goldsmith emphasized with such compassionate clarity. Thus fear dissolves the moment we stop looking to the world for what only spirit provides. For fear, he taught, is not an enemy to be conquered nor a force to be resisted. Fear is simply the inevitable result of believing that the outer world holds power over our well-being. When we think our safety depends on circumstances, when we imagine our peace is tied to conditions, when we expect security from people, institutions, or possessions, fear becomes unavoidable. It is the natural byproduct of placing trust in what is temporary, shifting, and uncertain. Goldsmith explained that fear always begins with misidentification. We identify ourselves with the body rather than the life that animates it, with our status instead of our essence, with our possessions instead of the source from which all good flows. And once we identify ourselves wrongly, everything that threatens those outer forms becomes a threat to our inner peace. In this way, the world becomes a place of constant vigilance, something to guard against, wrestle with, or escape from. But when consciousness begins to turn inward, when the invisible presence becomes more real than appearances, something within us shifts. The basis of fear weakens not because the world changes, but because our relationship to it changes. We stop expecting from the outer what only the inner can give. We stop demanding from circumstances what only the presence can supply. And gradually fear loses the oxygen it once fed upon. Goldsmith often said that fear is nothing more than faith inverted, faith placed in appearances. When we believe that a condition has power, we fear it. When we believe a person can control our destiny, we fear them. When we believe lack has reality, we fear the future. But when appearances are seen as appearances, shadows without substance, fear begins to evaporate like mist in sunlight. This is why he urged seekers to shift their attention from the outer picture to the inner reality, not by denying appearances or pretending they don't exist, but by recognizing that they do not define the truth of our being. The more we look to spirit as our supply, our protection, our wisdom, our harmony, the less we cling to the unstable structures of the world. And the less we cling, the less we fear losing them. Goldsmith emphasized that fear cannot be removed through effort. Trying to conquer fear with willpower only strengthens it, because the attempt itself assumes fear is real and must be fought. Instead, fear dissolves in awareness of the presence that stands behind us, within us, as our very life. When this presence feels near, even subtly, fear naturally recedes. When the mind becomes quiet enough to sense the divine activity flowing beneath the surface of every experience, fear no longer finds a place to root itself. He illustrated this by saying that darkness is not something you chase away, you simply turn on the light. In the same way, fear is not something to battle, it is something that fades when spiritual illumination dawns. And this illumination is not the product of thought, but the result of resting in the inner assurance that life itself is supporting you, guiding you, and expressing through you. As this awareness deepens, a new kind of confidence emerges, not arrogance, not bravado, but quiet certainty. A confidence that does not depend on outcomes, a peace that does not depend on conditions, a strength that has nothing to do with force. It is the confidence of one who has discovered their refuge is not in the world, but in the presence that animates and sustains all life. And in this discovery, fear loses its voice, its authority, its meaning, because the soul has begun to remember where its true security lies. And this gradual remembrance brings us directly into the sixth truth Goldsmith regarded as the most sobering of all. The final warning that delay in turning inward is the only real danger. For once the seeker begins to sense the inner presence, once fear loosens its grip and the world loses its hypnotic authority, the path becomes clear, not easy, not loud, but unmistakably clear. Yet Goldsmith observed that many, even after tasting the peace of inner communion, drift back into reliance on outer things. Not out of rebellion, but out of habit. The pull of the senses, the urgency of circumstances, the old patterns of thinking. They lure the individual back into believing that life is governed from outside rather than from within. And this, Goldsmith warned, is the true danger, not the events of the world, not the storms of circumstance, not the challenges that come and go, but the subtle temptation to postpone the inner journey until a better time, a quieter season, a moment when life feels more accommodating. He saw that many people intend to deepen their inner practice, soon, to return to silence when things settle, to rely on spirit once this crisis is over. But outward conditions rarely settle for long. Crises return in new forms, and the perfect moment, if we rely on the world to give it to us, never quite arrives. Goldsmith taught that the spiritual path must be lived now, in the midst of whatever life presents, not because God demands it, but because consciousness shapes experience, and delayed awakening means continued entanglement in the illusions of the world. He spoke with remarkable directness when addressing this, that every day spent seeking security in the outer strengthens the sense of separation and prolongs the cycle of fear, effort, and disappointment. Not as punishment, but as the inevitable consequence of looking for light in the shadow. He urged seekers to recognize that the inner presence is not something to turn to after solving life's problems. It is the very thing that dissolves the root of those problems. Waiting for circumstances to improve before going inward is like waiting for a fire to cool before reaching for water. The inward turning is not an escape from life. It is the only entry into real living. This is why he emphasized that the danger is not in the events themselves, no matter how dramatic they appear, but in misinterpreting them as powers. Every outer disturbance is, in truth, a call to return to center. Every difficulty is a reminder to reconnect with the presence that alone can reveal the way through. But if these invitations are ignored, if the mind insists on handling life alone, then the old patterns continue, fear rises again, struggle returns, and the peace once tasted fades into memory. Goldsmith knew that the most subtle illusion of all is the belief that we have time, unlimited time, to awaken. Not in the sense of mortality, but in the sense of consciousness. For the longer we remain entangled in outer reliance, the more deeply ingrained the habit becomes. And habits of consciousness, once established, tend to recreate themselves automatically, day after day, year after year. This is why he spoke of urgency, not worldly urgency, but spiritual urgency. The urgency of not postponing the inward gaze. The urgency of realizing that freedom is available now, but must be accepted now. The urgency of understanding that the presence waiting within is not a distant promise, but a living reality seeking expression through you. He reminded his students that delays are not neutral, they carry a cost. Not a moral cost, but a spiritual one. The cost of continuing to live under the hypnosis of appearances, the cost of seeking stability in unstable things, the cost of forgetting the very source of life while chasing its shadows. And so his final warning was not a threat, not a prediction, not a statement of doom, but a compassionate plea. Do not wait for the world to give you permission to awaken. Do not wait for a quieter season, a safer moment, a more comfortable situation. For the only true danger is postponing the surrender that reconnects you to the infinite invisible, the only power, the only life, the only peace your soul has ever longed for.